January doesn't seem like the best time of the year for a fishing trip in Vermont, Jeff. I mean, it's freezing up here. It's got to be far below zero.
Well, it's the perfect time of year if you're ice fishing.
All right, well, that's fair, but do we have to go so far north for this fish? We're practically on the Canadian border here by Lake Memphremagog.
This fish is a legend, Ray, and they say it lives in the coldest waters in Vermont in this lake. So that's where we're going.
But these fishing poles, I mean, they're pretty small to catch a legend, aren't they?
Yeah, but these poles should do fine. This legendary fish is a trout. It's only 10 to 15 inches in length.
Okay, but what makes this trout so special?
During the coldest part of winter, they say this trout is covered in fur. Today, we're fishing for the beaver trout of Vermont. Hi, I'm Jeff Belanger.
And I'm Ray Auger. Welcome to episode 126 of the New England Legends podcast. If you give us about 10 minutes, we'll give you something strange to talk about today.
Thank you for coming along with us as we find and chronicle every legend in New England one story at a time. We do that with a lot of help from our growing community of legend hunters who are sharing our stories and episodes and who are contacting us with the local legends that they love. Feel free to reach out to us anytime on our legend line at 617-444-9683. You can call or text us on there. You can even leave our show closing if you want to hear yourself on a future episode.
And hey, we can't do this without the help of our Patreon patrons.
So true.
These legendary listeners kick in just $3 per month to keep us going and growing. They get early access to new episodes plus bonus episodes that no one else gets to hear. Head over to patreon.com/New England Legends to become a bigger part of our story.
Okay, Ray, are you ready to go ice fishing?
I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Jeff.
Okay.
But I got to admit, I've never done this before.
Neither have I, but there's a first time for everything. We'll just drill through the ice here.
All right, tell me about this beaver fish.
Okay, up here in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, for over a century and a half, there's been talk of a special kind of trout, one that grows a fur coat to keep it warm in the frigid winter waters.
All right, wait a minute. I thought only mammals grow fur.
I thought that too, and yet, check out this postcard from 1927.
All right. Well, there's a man holding a stick and line through a hole in the ice.
Right.
Under him, it reads, "Fishing for beaver trout, Iceberg Cove." Under it, wow. Okay, there's a fish that looks like your basic freshwater fish.
Right.
But it's covered in a fur coat. Man, Jeff, I hate fish.
I know you do.
I mean, they freak me out with or without fur. And I can honestly say they don't get cuter with a pelt.
And under the fish on this postcard, it says Memphremagog fur-bearing trout. And in parentheses, it says beaver trout.
That's crazy. I've never heard of anything like this before.
So this story comes up in newspaper archives again and again over the last 150 years, and it seems to have started just after the Civil War.
Then let's head back to the mid-1800s and set this up. It's the winter of 1861 here in Newport, Vermont, on the shores of Lake Memphremagog. Two young men, Zophad Manser and Theophilus Grout, are ice fishing on the lake. That's when the boys pull up a fish unlike anything they've ever seen before.
Right. This fish has a fur coat. Now they bring their catch into Newport, and it's the talk of the town for weeks. Is this some kind of new animal? Is this some great scientific discovery? Everyone is buzzing.
But folks in Newport can't ponder this discovery too long because something big is about to go down. Shots are fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The United States is now at war with itself.
Zophad and Theophilus enlist in the Union Army and head south to battle the Confederates. And northern Vermont forgets all about this fur-bearing trout because obviously there's more important issues to discuss.
When the Civil War ends in 1865, Zophar and Theo both survive, though Zophar loses an arm. And maybe Theo loses his mind a little bit because he decides to come home to northern Vermont and go into the newspaper business.
Okay.
Still, the two men remain friends.
So picture this. One day, Zophar and Theo meet for lunch in a Newport, Vermont eatery. The two men are catching up over 2 bowls of oyster stew, talking about work and family, when one of the men brings up the fish they once caught on Lake Memphremagog.
Hey, Zoph, remember that furry trout we caught when we were boys?
The cafe goes silent. Everyone leans in to hear the story.
Now, Theo is no dummy.
No.
He sees the attention everyone in the restaurant is giving the story, and he knows that this story will sell some newspapers. So he heads back to write it up for the following day's newspaper. And just like that, the story spreads across Vermont's Northeast Kingdom.
There's a funny thing about fishing stories, Ray.
What's that?
Well, no one likes to be outdone.
Yeah.
So if you catch a fish and brag about it, I want to tell you about an even bigger fish that I caught.
I get it. If you say you had a good day of fishing and caught 6 fish, I'll tell you about the time I caught 10.
Exactly. So if you claim to have caught a fur-bearing trout, well, there's no way you're a better fisherman than me, so I better get out there and lay claim to one too.
Right, because only the most skillful anglers can land one of these rare breeds.
Soon, other newspapers are filling up with stories of other fishermen who said they've also caught fur-bearing trout, and then a nickname is born.
The Beaver Trout. That's what we'll call it. The Beaver Trout.
The funny thing about news cycles is that no matter what's being reported or how interesting the story may be, eventually people get bored and they move on.
So the beaver trout story dies down for a while. But then we jump ahead to 1927. A Vermont fisherman named Ralph Sessions heads out to Iceberg Cove on Lake Memphremagog to do some ice fishing. There he is holding a line over the hole that he cut in the ice. And that's when his photograph was taken. Sessions claims to catch the elusive beaver trout. He even takes a picture to prove it. The photo of the furry trout and Sessions fishing on the ice becomes the Christmas postcard we mentioned earlier.
So the legend gets a shot in the arm now. It's been decades since the buzz about the beaver trout, and now folks are buzzing again because they have a photo to talk about.
Plenty of people look at the photo of the beaver trout and believe it's an obvious fake.
All right.
Some think this is more of the work of a skilled taxidermist as opposed to the odd hand of God.
And then the story dies down again. But then in 1945, the beaver trout makes the papers once more. A man named Harry Richardson claims he's caught the trout and also produces a photo to prove it. And suddenly, others are clamoring for the fish. A man in Connecticut asks for a dozen of them to make a custom pair of mittens.
A man from Oklahoma sees a story in the papers and asks for as many beaver trout as possible so that he can breed them.
But this fish is so elusive
Or not real.
that no mittens are made, no breeding stock are ever caught, and the story dies down again for a few more decades.
It's now April of 1974, and the Burlington Free Press runs an article on the beaver trout. Just like before, locals respond, like fisherman E.G. Warren, who writes a letter to the editor.
I was very pleased to read Bishop's article on his experience with fur-bearing trout. This is the first time I've ever heard of one being taken from a brook. You have to fish deep with a heavy sinker, about 2 feet above the bait. Worms quickly freeze. Owing to the frozen bait and great depth, a strike seems comparatively feeble. It takes patience and some experimenting to land one of these rare fish. They never come near the surface as they suffer from perspiring in warmer waters. I've caught only 3 in years of fishing. E.G. Warren, St. Albans, Vermont.
By this time, the beaver trout legend starts getting weirder. The story is you need to use an ice worm that's so delicate only a master can hook one. And you have to fish in the deepest and coldest waters. That the fish only has this fur coat in the winter, so there's no point in fishing for one in the summer. And the reason you can't bring your catch into town to show others is because the beaver trout is so sensitive to the warmer temperatures at the surface that the fish will actually evaporate in a short period of time once you pull it out of the water.
Oh, come on.
That's what they say.
All right, still around northern Vermont, you can find a store or two with a mounted furry beaver trout on the wall. It's just enough to keep the legend alive for locals and tourists. And that brings us back to today. All right, Jeff, this is sounding like a fishing story on steroids to me.
I get that, but there's so many stories over the span of maybe 150 years. And the letters to the paper. I mean, how do you get that many people in on a hoax? Plus, I did a little research and I found this thing.
Ew.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm reading the description. It's called a hairy frog.
Right. Give this a read.
All right. I can't pronounce the Latin name, so I won't even try.
Fair
Jeff.
enough, right.
But it's also known as the horror frog or the wolverine frog. It's found in Central Africa, and the males of the species grow these hair-like structures on the sides of their bodies and legs that are used during mating. Yeah, it looks like really coarse hair, like a dude's beard.
It's technically not hair, though it does look a lot like it. Those things have arteries that are used to store extra oxygen when the male stays with the eggs for a long period of time.
So we already know that nature is weird, right?
It is, yeah.
Even weirder than we can imagine. So maybe there's something to this fur-bearing trout story. I think we're going to need some help with this one, Jeff.
I agree, Ray, which is why we made a call to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and spoke to this guy.
Judd Kratzer. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department.
All right, I'm curious, Judd. Have you ever heard of the beaver fish before we reached out to you?
I've been working here since 2006. So I learned about it early on. One of the employees that we had at the time, he told me about the legend of the fur-bearing trout. One of the foresters in our office had a copy of that postcard on the window of his office, so I'd seen it there. But this seasonal employee that we had, we were up in the Evansville area, and we stopped in at the Evansville Trading Post, and he took me in to show me the mounted version that's on the wall there. So that was the first time I got to see one.
Wait a minute. Is Judd saying this thing is for real? A mounted version for all to see at Evansville Trading Post?
Well, not quite. It turns out Evansville isn't the only place with a mounted trout covered in fur. Others have taxidermied their own version.
I guess it's kind of like an inside joke for the entire Northeast Kingdom. Kind of nice to have something like that that's unique to this area. You don't hear stories about trout with fur on them from anywhere else.
Is it possible there's some natural explanation for this? I'd hate to think it's some big hoax that's been going on since the time of the Civil War.
It turns out there might be something to that, Ray. Judd Kratzer explains.
There is actually a disease called ick that sometimes even fish in an aquarium will get. It's a fungus, and it's a white, fuzzy covering that gets on the fish that could look like fur in some cases.
Now, I had a fish tank as a kid, and I recall my fish getting ick on occasion. Especially when looking at the fish through the water, it can look like fur. But the reality is, there's no fish that are also mammals. And the postcard and even the mounted versions are just hoaxes. Hoaxes that are just believable enough to keep the legend alive. And sometimes, legends get help from the highest authorities.
But you're not suggesting...
Judd?
I think I've been one that has promoted the gag than others. I guess seeing that the one at the Evansville Trading Post, and then there's actually one at the Stonehouse Museum in Brownington. And I do my own taxidermy. When I first came here in my office, there was an old mounted lake trout that was kind of falling apart. And so it sat there for a while. And then after I heard about the beaver trout, I was like, I should make my own. So I took that lake trout, which needed some fixing up anyway, and I had some muskrat pelts at home, and I glued the muskrat pelts to it, and now Vermont Fish and Wildlife has our own mounted beaver trout here in St. Johnsbury.
So it's a great story that's never quite dismissed by everyone because maybe you've heard the story and maybe you caught the glimpse of something in the water that one time, and suddenly you tell a friend.
Who tells another friend.
Who tells another.
And the next thing you know, you've got a mounted beaver trout on the wall of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and then a couple of yahoos from a New England podcast call you to talk about it.
All right, you've got to see the picture of this fur-bearing trout.
You do.
Judd Kratzer was kind enough to share the photo of him holding his beaver trout and his baby. If you go to ournewenglandlegends.com, just click on episode 126 to see the photo.
On our website, we also posted that postcard of the beaver trout from 1927.
Hey, folks, do us a favor and post a review of our show on Apple Podcasts. That goes a long way in helping others find us.
We'd like to thank Judd Kratzer and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department for weighing in on this week's story, and would also like to thank Dustin Perry for lending his voice acting talents this week. And of course, our theme music is by John Judd.
This is Joseph Ames from Ospey, New Hampshire. I don't really have a story, but I just want to say the bazaar is closer than you think.